Okay, hello everyone. My name is Xiaoqing Hu. First time I'm presenting in this working group. So today I'm presenting a proposal of the render blocking attribute for link resources and scripts. So right now in current browsers, we already have a render blocking mechanism. For example, if we have some external style sheets in a page and also scripts. And then a typical timeline in current browsers is like after navigation, we block rendering while loading the scripts and style sheets. And only when they are all loaded and when the scripts are executed, then we start rendering them. While we already have such a render blocking mechanism, it has some fallbacks or limitations. So the first one is just a common practice, but it's not really a well-specified behavior. So browser behaviors actually differ slightly. For example, while rendering is blocked, does request animation frame callback fire? It's actually a good question because if we check the HTML spec, it says this callback fires only when we are rendering. But yeah, we don't have the spec of what's render blocking. And the second one is this render blocking mechanism only supports style sheets and scripts. And sometimes we might want to block on some other types of resources. And the last one is it only supports parser inserted resources. So if we have some resources inserted by the script, then we don't have any way to block render on it. And this might cause some problems, as we'll see in the use cases I'm going to introduce. So the proposal is a render blocking attribute. So we can put it on a style sheet to make it explicitly render blocking, or put it on a preload resource so that we block rendering on this resource, or we can put it on a script. And well, at this stage, it might seem redundant to put render blocking on style sheets and scripts. We'll see use cases. So one of the major use cases is we would like to eliminate layout shift caused by web fonts. The way we do it is we preload a web font and we put render blocking attribute on the preload link. How does it work? So typically, web font works like, so we first render the page with a fallback font while the web font is loading, and after the web font is loaded, we do a font swap. So we change it into the web font, re-render the page, and this causes a layout shift. So by render blocking on the web font, we're just not rendering anything with the fallback font. So since there's no font change, font swapping, there's no layout shift at all. And by the way, there are some other approaches to tackle this layout shift elimination problem. And if we have time, we can go into it later. The second use case is we can put render blocking on an async script. So by default, async script doesn't block parser, but we don't really know if when it's executed. So it's executed once it's loaded. And in some cases, there are some scripts like, for example, an A/B testing framework that it's not that important, so that it doesn't have to block rendering, it doesn't have to block parsing, but we would like it to be executed before rendering starts so that we can do some certain tasks. we can set up the testing framework before rendering starts, so that, for example, we can properly measure some metrics in rendering. The next use case is to prevent a flash of unstyled contents when we have a loader script. So here we have a animation of it's actually a screen recording from a real website, and this is what happens when the website loads. So we see a very bad flash of unstyled content. Well, not actually a flash, and a lot of content shifting. And the reason is that this website is using a loader script, so that all the style sheets and so the framework code, etc., are inserted by the script, so that they do not block rendering. So when we load the page, we just first render everything without styling, and then styles and framework code is loaded, and everything got restyled and shifted around, which is pretty bad. And so with the render blocking attribute, we can solve it pretty easily. So by just putting the render blocking attribute to the script inserted style sheets and scripts. Okay, so now before going into the detailed proposal, here we have some prerequisite, which is what is render blocking? As I mentioned earlier, actually the render blocking concept is not specified. So we need to standardize this concept. So basically, the proposal is after navigation, the user agent enters a render blocking period, and there's no render blocking opportunity during this period. And the period ends when all the render blocking resources have finished loading, either successful or not. And by standardizing this concept, actually, we have a side effect or side product, which is actually a good side product. So we can actually have a JavaScript listener of when the first rendering starts. So the listener is just we just need to register a request animation frame callback in the document head, so that when the callback fires, it's at the first rendering cycle. And with this callback, we can do things like, for example, examine when the first rendering starts, or examine what resources are loaded when rendering starts, and even say put progress bars, whatever. Okay, so the technical details, so finally the technical details of this proposal. So it's a Boolean attribute. It has to be put on elements in head, and it works on, so, and the element must be inserted before parser inserts body, which means it must be in head. And it doesn't care whether the element is parser inserted or script inserted. It works on both types. And if it's on a link element, it has to be style sheet or preload. And if it's on script element, it must not be a deferred script, because defer means to align with document content loaded event, and this doesn't really work together. And of course, the other attribute on that element should allow the user agent to fetch the resource. For example, it must not be a disabled resource. And if it's an style sheet, the media curve must be evaluated to true, and etc. And here are some extensions of this proposal we considered but didn't put into the initial proposal. So the first one is before first render event. So this event fires when we are about to run the first rendering cycle. But it's just the same as putting a request animation frame callback in document head. So it's just a pure syntactic sugar. The second one is render blocking equals false. So which means if we put this on an element, put it on a resource, then it's not a render blocking resource. So it's mainly for asynchronous style sheets. But currently we already have some workarounds that are slightly more complicated, but not really too complicated. We just use JavaScript to load the resource or preload the style sheet and use JavaScript to enable it when it's loaded. Not too complicated. Or we can set render blocking equals 500 milliseconds, which means the resource is render blocking, but if it takes more than 500 milliseconds to load, then after 500 milliseconds, it doesn't block rendering anymore. It can still load, but just doesn't block it. So this allows developers to decide what the user experience is like if the network connection speed is slow, but the problem is it's hard to decide. So we think it's not really a core part of the proposal, so didn't put it in. And finally, it can be put in a actually larger scope. So if we think about render blocking, it's actually synchronizing certain events in the page lifetime. So for render blocking, we want the loading of certain resources to be before the rendering. And if we think about it in this way, there are a lot more things that we can synchronize. So here we have, so Europe actually has a bigger proposal which defines a lot of milestones in the page lifetime, so that we can synchronize loading of resources to before or after the milestones. For example, first paint, which is essentially the same as first render, or DCL, or load, or a lot more. Okay, so any questions, or do we want to get into some? Actually, let me finish this since we have time. So this is what I call a web font trilemma. Web font trilemma. So when using web font, the typical user experience expectation is like we want it to be as fast and as stable as a locally installed font, but it's actually not achievable. So we cannot. So there are three goals of. So we want the web font to be consistently used. We want no layout shifting. We want no rendering delay, just like a local font. But we can actually just achieve two of them. So if we want no layout shifting and no rendering delay, then there's font display optional, which means the font is not guaranteed to be used. Or if we can tolerate some layout shifting, then it's pretty much just the current behavior, just the default behavior, and we have some some other techniques to align the metrics of fallback font and the actual web font, so that the layout shift can be sort of minimized, but it's not eliminated because the two fonts are still different. You can't perfectly align two different fonts. And so this proposal is the last edge of this dilemma. So if we can allow some rendering delay, then we can achieve the font being consistently used and no layout shifting. That's it. Okay, questions? Yeah, Andy?
Yeah, just a sec. Let me stop the recording.